Good morning and welcome back to all of you who were here yesterday. And I would also like to welcome those of you who are joining us today, this morning. We have a full packed day, yet shorter day, and I hope you will enjoy today's presentations, which is in the morning, is focused on presentations from data that was collected in prison facilities. We have a great team of presenters, panels, and also discussant. And in the afternoon, we will be focusing on special populations. We have 2 sessions. One is focused on older adults, and the other one is focused on low-skilled adults. And then before the end of the day, which I encourage you all to stay to listen to our NCES's colleagues regarding what is coming up in the US in regard to PIAAC, in regard to reports that will be released soon. So at this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Andrisse, Stanley Andrisse. It's my honor that he accepted our invitation to present today at this conference. Dr. Andrisse is Executive Director of From Prison Cells to PhD, Assistant Professor at Howard University College of Medicine, and Adjunct Assistant Professor at Johns Hopkins Medicine, researching type 2 diabetics and insulin resistance. Dr. Andrisse completed his PhD at St. Louis University and his MBA and bachelor's degree at Lindenwood University. He's also founder of the Diversity Postdoctoral Alliance, member on several local and national committees aimed at community outreach, youth mentor, motivational speaker, and he is a community activist. Dr. Andrisse, thank you so much for accepting.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for the PIAAC committee for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here and share a little bit about myself and some things that I have going on, as well as some stories and statistics that I feel might be relevant to this audience. So as most of you who may have interacted with me in the past day have noticed, I have my beautiful wife and daughter here with me, and only about just a little over 7 weeks old, Ashlyn Odette Hope, and it definitely has given me a new perspective, as all the parents, I'm sure, know with their first child. So I'm going to kind of jump right in. There's a time thing, and I know I'm going to be getting cards flashed at me. So I'm going to jump right into things. I'm definitely going to talk a little bit about myself and some of these things. I encourage you to follow me and the conversation on social media. And in fact, in order to continue the conversation, the age that we're in, we are deliverers of knowledge. That's what everyone was doing yesterday. That's what the folks will be doing today. That's what I'm, doing here now. But we want to continue this outside of this realm. As the deliverers of knowledge, it was said yesterday that we need to make sure that we're getting this into the hands of the people that can actually, that are on the ground making change. So I encourage you to continue the conversation on social media. We're in an age now that is an avenue that is often taken. So you'll be seeing this little social media check-in image throughout the presentation. If you see something you like that you like to tweet, put on Facebook, put on Instagram, feel free to do that. I gave you some hashtags that you could use as well. And you feel free to tag me as well with the different handles that I've included here. Any questions on that? Instructions. All right. So the first thing, this is going to be an interactive talk. It's going to have to be a quick interactive talk, just as I mentioned. But we're going to get right into this interactive portion. So I'll need you all to get out your phones. I know you're eating, so in between putting food in your mouth, if you could pull out your cell phones and text Stanley, Andri 621 to 37607. And that will allow you to join this audience response system. So we'll have a few of these questions, so I'll need you to partake in this first question. So if you can either go to the website if you have your laptops out or on your cell phones, or you can just text Stanley, Andri 621 to the number 37607. And then once you do that, it'll tell you that you've joined. And then now you can just press one of those letters and join in the conversation. So I'll give everyone about 30 seconds, and then you can just start putting your answer in as you go. All right. Okay. Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to give it about 30 seconds for folks to respond. We'll give you a little bit longer time since this is the first question, but I'll be looking at my watch here for about, allow folks about 20 to 30 seconds to give a response. All right, and then I'm going to lock the question, if I can figure out how to do that. We could just have people responding as they feel. All right, so it looks like most people think that about how old do I look? Most people say about 30 to 35. We got a few outliers with 18 and 50. Okay. So we'll leave it at that. So 30 to 35 is what most people think that about how old I look, with a few outliers. Next question. About how old do you think I am? You're probably thinking, like, that's the same question, right? No, it's how old do I look versus how old do you think I am? Because, like, you saw some credentials, and I know a lot of people are like, wow, these credentials and stuff like that. So how old do you think I look? Or how old do you think I am? Excuse me. About 15 seconds. Okay. So relatively about still maybe few people think slightly older. Okay. Very good. So to close out and answer that question, you don't need to know. Asking that question is actually a form of discrimination in a way, right? Why would somebody ask that question? Because you look so young. Well, what's another similar question that people make presumptions based on? Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Why are employers or schools asking this? Because they are hoping to make a presumption about you. They're hoping to prejudge you. All you really need to know is that I was invited here because I do this quite often, and they thought that I would be fitting to be here in front of you because I'm qualified to be here in front of you. That's really all that matters. So to jump into things, we're here to talk about incarceration today. So in terms of global incarceration, and again, as I give these talks, I like to think of it as if we're looking at a painting on a wall, there's many different ways to conceptualize or draw opinions on that painting, but that painting has certain facts to it. So I like to frame the conversation before we start to have the conversation. So to make sure that you're not looking at this painting and then I'm looking at this painting, we're looking at different things. We need to be looking at the same thing. So global incarceration around the globe, it's fairly well known, especially probably by this audience, or maybe not, that the U.S. is the #1 incarcerator of people, right? We have the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. We incarcerate more people than any other country. Countries that we would consider to be have backwards politics, have communist politics, have these heinous punishment systems, we incarcerate more than they do. And in fact, if you look at this, this image here, places that we have extreme issues with in the way that they treat their people, places like North Korea, Russia, China, we incarcerate nearly 4 times as much as they do. We have the highest rate of solitary confinement, which is defined by the UN as a means of torture. Yet we're constantly saying that places like North Korea, Russia, China are torturing their people. Well, what are we doing right here at home? What are we doing right here in the greatest nation in the world? And, so what does that mean, right? It means a person like myself standing here in front of you. So I am a formerly incarcerated person with not 1, not 2, but 3 felony convictions. I was once told by a prosecuting attorney that I had no hope for change. No hope. I was eventually sentenced to 10 years in prison for drug trafficking charges. And when I was released, for me, it was education that helped break some of the remnants of incarceration. So to tell you really quickly a little bit more about myself, so I was raised in the Ferguson, Missouri area. I started making poor decisions at a very young age. I started selling drugs at a very young age. I was arrested for the first time at 14 years old. I was involved in the juvenile justice system. I continued to make poor decisions until the point that I was in my early 20s, sitting in front of a judge facing 20 years to life for drug trafficking charges. And as I just mentioned, this prosecutor was painting this picture of this dangerous threat to society, and she was successful in sentencing me as a prior and persistent career criminal in my early 20s. So I'm now, as what was just introduced, a professor at Johns Hopkins, Howard University, in the College of Medicine, and I teach and I work with scholars who are about 25 to 30 years old who are working to be doctors and physicians. And it's not until about another 16 plus years before we consider them to be career professionals. Yet this prosecutor in my early 20s was prophesizing that I was a career criminal with no hope for change. And I'm now Dr. Stanley Andrisse, an endocrinologist scientist and professor at Johns Hopkins Medicine and Howard University College of Medicine. I would say that I probably changed just a little bit from what she was saying, right? But at that time, when I was sentenced to 10 years in prison, when I was in my early 20s, I went into prison just having been told that I was this terrible person. And I internalized that. I believed that. I went into prison very much thinking that I was going to be in this revolving door of incarceration, and I was just going to come out and find a way to be a better drug dealer when I got out. I was fortunate enough to encounter this mentor that saw a different trajectory for me. He saw a different vision. He saw a different path. Along with that, not too long after I was incarcerated, my father's health, my father who I had lost contact with throughout making all these poor decisions, his health began to plummet almost immediately when I went away. Within the course of about 2 years, he went through 30 different surgeries where they began amputating his limbs all the way up to his torso. he eventually fell into a coma and lost his battle with type 2 diabetes. This was a very emotionally devastating time to be locked in a cage while my family and my father were going through this situation on the outside. This emotional devastation was turned into the inspiration behind what I do now. I'm now, as I mentioned, a scientist that researches diabetes. I'm an endocrinologist. Tie that situation that I was going through with this mentor stepping into my life. Eventually, the seed was planted that I had the potential to move forward in education, and this mentor of mine started investing in that potential, and I started gaining the belief that I had this potential, and I eventually, when it was coming time for me to be released, I was convinced that I could pursue higher education. I applied to a number of programs. I applied to 6 programs to be exact. I was rejected from every single program except for the one that this mentor of mine was on the admissions committee. And that program was St. Louis University. St. Louis University offered me my second chance. And if I could actually just step back a little bit and go back even before I was sitting in that courtroom. So before I was sitting in that courtroom, I was under investigation for 9 months by the DEA before they came down with this 50-man raid that was resulted in one of the convictions that I had. And I would imagine that no one will probably raise their hand to this question. I would hope so. But how many of you have ever had 50 assault rifles aimed at your head? I could have very easily been Mike Brown laying there dead in the streets, and all they would have said was, oh, another young black thug selling drugs, dead in the streets. Who really cares? Black lives don't matter. He's just another drug dealer. What is he ever going to amount to? Right? When it was all said and done in terms of this investigation, there were 5 of us that were eventually indicted. 3 of us were black, 2 of us out of the group were white. All 3 of us, black males, ended up going to prison. The 2 white guys never stepped foot in a prison cell. And I say this just because I'm going to touch on that here in a second. With this idea of, I guess the prosecutor may have saw hope in their whiteness, but for me, I was hopeless. So I eventually, as I mentioned, got into St. Louis University. I finished at the top of my class. I finished with my PhD and my MBA in 4 years, which was at a much faster pace than some of my peers that I was in the program. It wasn't that I was this very intelligent person. I was hungry and thirsty for change. I moved on, as you can see, from that point to eventually move on to Johns Hopkins, then eventually move on to Howard University, where I'm a tenure-track assistant professor at Howard and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins. I just want to hit on this particular point, and this kind of touches back on what we were talking about yesterday. We must understand where we came from to understand where we are going. We must understand where we came from to understand where we are going. And I say that because where have we come from in this country? And where have we come from in many countries in this world? But in particularly speaking in the U.S., there's a point of this idea of slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. There's a clause in the Constitution that literally criminalizes blacks. It's called the Fugitive Slave Clause. We talked about yesterday this idea of blacks born in the 60s withdrawing back to poverty at a rate 3 times that of white counterparts. This was a study in the Brookings Institute. Another fact from that study is that blacks making $100,000 live in neighborhoods where whites are making $30,000. That's a result, very much so, of administration that was during the FDR time of the FHA and this predatory lending, what's called redlining. It's compounded itself to the point of this. Another thing that's really ties to this idea of mass incarceration is that during the Nixon administration, there was this individual by the name of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a scholar, and he was tasked at understanding poverty. And he came out with this seminal paper called The Negro Family. And he stated that the Negro family is like a diseased patient that is in need of being addressed, right? And his idea of addressing it was to maybe build some social programs. Well, Nixon at the time, he took this and said, we are going to take social action. And the social action that he took was the war on drugs and to start incarcerating people. And those people were primarily black people. The result of this, as we move forward, is that blacks with conviction have more difficulty getting a job than whites without conviction. This is studies done from two other Harvard sociologists, the late Dever Page and Robert Sampson. So one of the things that I want to tie this to is this idea of we have to understand where we came from and understand where we're going. Those closest to the problem are those closest to the solution, yet often furthest from resources and power. This is a quote by a man by the name of Glenn Martin, who's the founder of an organization called Just Leadership USA, which is aimed at reducing the prison population. His idea is that we need to amplify the voices of people like myself who have been directly impacted by crime and incarceration by organizing, educating, and putting them in positions of leadership. So to hit on mass incarceration a little further, it's a sad fact that, you know, when I go and speak in audiences, like I speak in schools in Baltimore City, I can literally look in the audience and say, 1, 2, 3, you're gonna go to prison. 1, 2, 3, you're gonna go to prison. And I'm not Oprah handing out brand new cars. You know, this is the United States of America destroying lives. And I know there's some, again, we have to look at the painting. That was my perception of the painting. You may have a different perception, but we're gonna talk about that a little bit. The war on drugs was started in the 1970s. As I was mentioning, you can see the prison population increased by nearly 800%. The people that have been primarily impacted are people of color. And when we look at it in a different perspective, this 2.2 million people who are locked in cages, a lot of people see incarceration as this thing of poverty. Well, when you break it down to folks who are non-poor and poor, black non-poor individuals who are incarcerated make up nearly as many white, poor, and non-poor. So it's not really just a thing of poverty. It's really a thing for all black people. It's really more a thing of people of color. So does incarceration work? We found, studies have found that it's particularly ineffective at reducing certain kinds of crime, youth crimes, drug crimes. These are, we've now come to the understanding that drug crimes are really a public health issue. They're not an incarceration issue. This is something that people need assistance with. Another interesting thing is that there's studies that find that people age out of crime. So crime peaks in the mid-20s, and this is, if I could just tell a quick story about my daughter. So I'm this new father, right? And I'm an endocrinologist. I know a little bit about reproduction and babies, but I really don't. So I started reading about them, and I found that babies around 3 weeks old, as they're developing, and they're developing like every day, at 3 weeks old, they will discover that their limbs are attached to their body. Their brain actually makes that connection, like, wow, like my arms are attached to my body. So the brain literally hadn't made that connection yet. I mentioned earlier that the brain is not fully developed until 25 years old. The part of the brain that's not fully developed is emotional decision-making processes. So it's literally as if people cannot see their arms, these young adolescents, juvenile adults, young adults, it's as if they can't see their arms when they're making some of these decisions. So I ask you, should this prosecutor have been pushing to throw me away for life? Should we be throwing people away for life, or the long sentences that we're throwing down on these kids that aren't fully developed yet? Studies show that maybe we shouldn't be. And one of the answers to this question, in my opinion, is education. So we need to be focusing on education over this idea of incarceration. My vision of how this is, and I see this as a health issue. So my vision for a culture of health is one of inclusivity, equal justice, and equal educational and employment opportunity for all. The picture at the top are some folks that I work with in Baltimore City who, when I told them that I was a professor at Howard University, they were like, oh, what is that, a place where a bunch of white kids go, a bunch of white rich kids? No, not exactly. It's an HBCU. So these folks don't really understand that college is for them. And, the program that I'll tell you about very briefly is where we're helping move those kids that think that this is not for them into the picture at the bottom. And in terms of the theory of change behind this, there's studies that that is discussed within today from the Rand Corporation that education reduces recidivism by nearly 43%. Additionally, education is 4 to 5 times less costly than reincarcerating the person. So it not only helps the individual, it costs society less. So furthering one education is healthy for everyone, the individual, the family, and the community. So to dive into a little bit of statistics, it's nearly impossible for formerly incarcerated job seekers to compete in an economy that is increasingly demands high skills. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, and this chart shows that 40 years ago, there were more low-skilled jobs available, but at the state that we're in now, those types of jobs are being decreasing. So educational attainment in the U.S. So roughly 90% of the general public has a GED or higher, compared to 75% of formerly incarcerated. So there's a 1.2-fold difference. But when we look at college degree attainment, nearly 30% of the general public has a college degree, compared to 4% of formerly incarcerated. So this is nearly 9-fold difference. So it's very clear where we need to be focusing on. And prisons they've taken a concerted effort to give people GED and high school equivalents. So it would make sense that we can make this concerted effort to try to increase the higher degree attainment or college degree attainment for the incarcerated population as well. Looking at this data a different way, it's about the general public has about a 1 in 3 chance of attaining college degree, whereas formerly incarcerated people have about a 1 in 20 chance of attaining a college degree. So there's clearly a lot of work to be done. So we're to another question. So let's see if I can move this out of the way. So what is the most common word used to describe someone who has a felony conviction? So about 15 seconds. All right, so I think I locked it. So it looks like, for the most part, people are saying convict, ex-con, criminal offender, ex-offender, and looks like a few people may have said person. Okay. So what is the best word to use to describe someone who has a felony conviction? So what is the most common versus what do you feel is the best? And this is what I was, so about 15 seconds. So we see that we're calling people who have convictions all different types of things, except for what we in this room feel is the best thing to call them. And as I read through some of the abstracts, I saw inmate, I saw offender, I didn't really see criminal, but definitely inmate and offender seem to be this word that is okay to use. And one of the things that I want to move to is this ideas of barriers to education. One of the first barriers to education is this psychological piece. When I went into prison, I very much felt and believed deep within me that I was this criminal. And it was further perpetuated. Folks on the yard, we called each other criminals and cons and ex-cons. And then the guards called us these words. So after time, time goes by, and we have the belief that we are criminals. And then now we have people like yourselves who are the disseminators of knowledge, and we're still using these wording that we're putting into our policies and the wording that we're disseminating to the masses, and we're still calling people inmates, offenders, ex-cons. This is perpetuating one of the barriers. I won't go into all of these barriers, but the actual box on the criminal conviction question, the fact that Pell Grants are not available to incarcerated individuals, the fact that the FAFSA has a question asking about drug convictions and criminal convictions, and then also just this idea of having this X in your back, the actual minute and barriers that most people aren't thinking about that stop people from pursuing education. Things like lack of advising, lack of mentoring and tutoring, the actual logistics. Some people don't have transcripts. It's been years since they've been out of school. How do they get their high school transcripts? And some colleges don't even accept things past 2 to 3 years. So these are all different barriers to education. I was just the keynote speaker at a conference called the National Conference on Higher Education in Prison. This was one of the questions that I asked the audience, which had about 200 folks in it, and a good number of them were formerly incarcerated people. When I asked them, for formerly incarcerated, did your criminal legal system involvement prevent you from pursuing your major of choice? And nearly all of them said that it did. So what that says is that people are not pursuing what their passions are, right? Tie that into this particular question where we're looking at asking program directors, how many majors are you offering in your prison programs, education programs, and most of them are only offering one major. So we're filtering people to this one type of major that, instead of giving them the opportunity to pursue what they want. So the next phase of higher education, as I see it, is that we need to promote higher degree attainment, smooth transitions from prison to outside of campus programs, promoting degree attainment outside of the social sciences, so letting people pursue what they want to pursue, and building coalitions and utilizing success stories to address different barriers. And my program, I'm running close to out of time, so just to talk a little bit about our program called Prison to Professionals. We're not trying to help people pursue PhDs or doctorates. We're helping people pursue their innate excellence. We want to help people tap into and reach their full potential. So we are investing in that potential. The name is a metaphor symbolizing going from a place of despair to moving to a place of self-worth. And within our program, we have a number of people working on an assortment of great things. We have people who are scholars in our program who are moving into regenerative medicine. I always tout that we have one of our scholars who is going to be the first formerly incarcerated person to land on Mars, and there's nobody that has landed on Mars yet. But we have this type of brilliance within the formerly incarcerated population. And within our program, we have this type of brilliance. We have a number of people working on their PhDs. We got a few people working on their MDs as well. And how do we get there? We have to break the ceiling. We have to be trailblazers. We already have lawyers, professors, presidents, executive psychologists. I'm part of a group called the Formerly Incarcerated College Graduates Network, over 1,000 formerly incarcerated college graduates, and a good number of them have doctoral and professional degrees. We need to break the ceiling. And with that, I'm a couple minutes over, but I told you I was going to be. So a few takeaways that I would like for you to take away is that, the idea of the statistics, the picture of what mass incarceration is, the power and the transformational power of using education to address this idea of incarceration, and to really know that those closest to the problem are those that are closest to the solution. So I hope that you can support college after education, or support college after incarceration, and I thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions. I don't know, maybe just take some questions.
Maybe we'll... to.